Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Perkis from the University of London, and I'm going to be talking about embedding IAM in projects and services. And for those who don't know, because I mentioned IAM a couple of times, identity and access management. That's what I mean by IAM. So I'm going to be looking at what IAM is, so a few definitions perhaps, some of the benefits of IAM for projects and services, root and branch, twig and leaf, which is looking at the broader context for IAM and where IAM's going, and hopefully some conclusions at the end. So what is IAM? Here's a picture of Captain Twig from the USS Kane, and when I started at the University of London, I was asked how do we do IAM, and so I followed his words. There's a right way, there's a wrong way, there's the Navy way, and there's my way. And if we do things my way, we'll get along. Of course, I didn't really say that. That would have been monumentally arrogant of me. But it's a good way of shoehorning Humphrey Bogart into my talk. This brings me on to definitions. Now, I could stick up a quote from Wikipedia or Gartner or something to introduce what IAM is. But the point I want to make is that you really need to be defining what IAM is and what IAM means for your organization, because it could mean any number of things. And if you define what it means for your organization, then you can use that as the basis to actually start getting the benefits from IAM. For some people, it's just going to be all about getting user accounts and groups. For me, I try and think of it as a little bit more than that. I try and think of it about how we get IT systems to know about the people within the organization. And that could be basic things like who they are, who the people in the organization are, but it's also how they prove who they are to those systems so that we can allow them in, and once they've got in, what they can do in there. So ultimately, it's going to be the stuff that dreams are made of. So I can shoehorn another Humphrey Bogart film, The Maltese Falcon. And you can see IAM is there, and everybody's just wants to get their hands on it. So, Humphrey Bogart. By way of an illustration about some of the concepts of IAM, we know Humphrey Bogart was a man of many parts. Captain Queeg we've come across from the K Mutiny. Rick Blaine from Casablanca. Fred Dobbs from The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Sam Spade from The Maltese Falcon, just to name a few. There are plenty more. So one person, many roles. In IAM terms, we often talk about personas for people, slightly different from roles in that you can have different attributes for different personas. You might have a nickname that you use for one system that you don't use for another system because you need to be treated more formally. So if you think of staff system, you may appear in one way in the staff system, you may appear slightly differently in a student system or in a visitor system or as an alumnus, but it's all the same person, you just have a slightly different set of attributes in different systems. And when we talk about IT systems that are storing data about these different types, these different personas that you might have, the chances are those systems are going to have identifiers within them. You might have a payroll number in the staff system. You probably should have a payroll number in the staff system. You'll have a student number if you're a student. Some kind of visitor ID if you're a visitor, hopefully. Maybe a donor ID or alumnus ID if you're in that database. And the chances are if you're joining the organization or a member of the organization, you're going to have various institutional identifiers of some kind. A user ID so that you can log into systems. An email address so that you can be contactable. Possibly an ID card so that you can prove who you are physically as well if you're challenged. And possibly some kind of institutional identifier that you can use to tie all these different bits of data together. Now there are plenty of perceptions around IAM, one of which is that IAM is just about user accounts. And I'm hoping to persuade you that it's about a little bit more than that. But typically for user accounts, we'll be taking data from one of these systems that's storing the data about people. We'll be performing some IAM magic on it. And out the other side, we'll get user accounts that people can use to log in. We'll be assigning people into groups so they can have access to the resources that they need. And possibly we'll also be syncing those identities out to cloud providers, software as a service providers. Increasingly, that's going to be the case. So the information about our people needs to actually be moving outside the organization as well. So a little bit more about data about people, because I think this is one of the key things to doing IAM well. Now, we've got particular challenges within the HE sector in that our people move around between different statuses, and the main systems for storing the data about our people can be split across multiple data sources. So we have people moving from being applicants to being students, maybe from being undergraduate to being postgraduate, from postgraduate possibly they're getting a research post. So they move around between the different systems that are storing data about them. And at the end they might become alumnus, and we may be providing services to our alumni. We also have people coming in from other organizations, and we need to keep track of them because they're collaborating on research and so on. So one of the things that we can do is to try and provide identifiers to kind of stitch all that data together. If you look, for example, at Humphrey Bogart on Wikipedia, you'll find a section towards the bottom that most of you may well have completely missed, called Authority Control, which contains all these funny numbers that are all unique identifiers for Humphrey Bogart. Because for different contexts, there are identifiers that you can use to actually kind of stitch all the data about people together. WorldCat, for example, contains lots of bibliographic information about Humphrey Bogart, and you can see there's a nice little chart there showing all the mentions for Humphrey Bogart in various books and things that he's been in. And there's one in there called the ISNI, which is the International Standard Name Identifier, which you might not be aware of, but lots of people have got them. And even your academics within your organization have probably got things like the ORCID, or the ORC ID, which they can use to actually uniquely identify them and all their research outputs. So there are a number of benefits of having these kind of identifiers, even for poor old Humphrey here. There are lots of numbers that we can use to distinctly identify him so we don't get him confused with, say, Dirk Bogarde, somebody with a similar name and a similar kind of profession, but actually quite a different person. So IT systems and people. So the three things that I mentioned before, what IAM can actually help with. So identifying who people are within the organization, how they can prove who they are, and what they can do when they're actually in a system. So the first thing is proving who you are. If anyone's familiar with the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, this is the bandit who's after the treasure seeker's gold. And at one point, famously within the film, he's asked to prove that he's a member of the police, which he claims. And the quote, and I'm not going to try the voice, is, "Badges, we don't got no badges, we don't need no badges, I don't have to show you any stinking badges." And of course, when we're getting our users to access our systems, we want them to show us their stinking badges so that we know who they are. So when we're talking about authentication, we're talking about getting user accounts for people, but probably also giving them identifiers that we can use to make those user accounts and use to identify them. We're talking about all the stuff around credentials management so that we can actually provide them with means of managing their passwords and their credentials, and possibly managing multi-factor authentication, assuming that's working. We might also be managing how we want our sysadmins to be authenticating and do something around privileged access and how we're managing those people that need privileged access to systems, how we're allowing them to authenticate, maybe putting extra checks in front of those accounts, but also providing, hopefully, the form of physical authentication for all our users, a photo ID card so that they can get into buildings and so on. Hopefully we're tying that together as much as possible. So once you're in a system, what can you do? And here's a picture of Humphrey Bogart with the letters of transit in Casablanca. The letters of transit, of course, would famously allow him to get out of Casablanca. And this is really authorization. So this is putting people in groups, typically, determining what people are entitled to do, and hopefully tying groups to entitlements so that we can automate what people can do. Possibly access to physical resources like library quotas and things like that, as well as access to systems. Possibly thinking about where people are accessing things from. And if we can do clever things, and it's increasingly more and more available, to do clever things with identifying where in the world people are trying to connect from and determining what we want them to do if they're connected from different places around the world. And also because we've got multiple buildings, access control over buildings, and potentially access control between different institutions that might share resources. So the third element is around the data around people. And so here's the cast of the Maltese Falcon, a mixed bag of people, for those of you who know the film. And for people data, typically we're going to be taking the data from these systems, these kind of core systems that we have containing data about people. We're going to be pulling that data into some kind of identity store so we can manage that data about people centrally. And then we can pass it out through maybe a provisioning engine of some kind, and that might range from just being scripts, or it might be some fancy thing that you've bought that allows you to create user accounts, populate groups, and potentially synchronize out to other providers outside the organization. But the other things that we can do with people data, if we've got it centralized, if we know who our people are in a kind of centralized, controlled way, we can use that to provide integration, to form part of an integration service, so we can pass the information about people within the organization out to other systems. And those might be other databases that we have, other systems that we have within the organization, or again, it might be other systems that we've got outside the organization. But getting systems to understand who the people are within the organization is going to be a key part of any integration. And also with data management, so we can provide the information about people as being a core element of the data that we're potentially increasingly doing around people within the organization. So we can pass the data about people, accurate data about people, out into our data warehouse or our data factory, I think that's it. That is, again, possibly out into the cloud for doing big data analytics, etc. And then we can provide that kind of management information support as well. So I chose the title Root and Branch really because hopefully you can see the benefits of having an emphasis on people from the bottom to the top of the IT estate. IAM is crucial for pretty much every IT service. People need to be able to log into them, and those systems need to understand who people are. IAM really is one of those kind of foundational elements to IT services. So look at some of the benefits of doing IAM. Standardized view of who people are. So we're not kind of getting confused between data coming from different systems about the same person. Hopefully with a single identifier to tie them together. Better automation, so that when people are starting, joining the organization, or changing within the organization, or leaving the organization, we can automate that process. We can remove people when they should no longer have access, but we can add them when they should have access. And also just simple things like when somebody's name changes, we're updating the staff directory automatically. They don't have to contact 5 or 6 different people or 5 or 6 different teams to get all the systems updated for something that should be just as simple as a name change. We're making sure the data is accurate and we're not getting confused between our Bogards and our Bogarts. Data is auditable, so we can track who's doing what. And we can provide that as proof of compliance with licensing and so on, based on knowing the number of people that have got access to things and when. And the data becomes reusable as well, so we can simplify our interfaces if we've got integration, we've got multiple integrations that might be all want to get information about people. We can offer standardized interfaces that allow standardized views of data to be passed between our systems. And all of these, hopefully, you can see, would help reduce the support costs, maintainability of interfaces, and all this kind of thing, if it's done well. So what does IAM mean potentially for service owners? Service owners like Rick Blaine here with the Café Americain in Casablanca. Well, the chances are your system will need to consume something, some identity data of some kind. Users will need to authenticate. They'll need to actually be presenting sets of credentials in order to log into your systems. You can potentially also be getting that information about who should be allowed to do what based on who the people are within the organization. And in terms of user profiles, you should hopefully be able to get the information that you need to present back to the users about who they are. So you can, it might just be as simple as showing a name when somebody logs in, but potentially other information about their entitlements and so on can all be pulled together and displayed back to them. And of course, some corporate systems are going to be, corporate systems will actually be providing that data about people out to identity services and beyond. The kind of thing you could expect, for example, your HR system to be providing out would be data about people, data about those people's association with the organization, and things like contact details so that we can keep in touch with them. And once that information is being passed out in a standardized way from those key corporate systems, we can use that to provide the data onwards as ID cards, building access for management information purposes, for other kinds of integration and automation. And again, that might well be synchronizing that data out to third-party providers, out to other organizations. It might also help us to secure those services by actually managing those privileged accounts, which often get unmanaged. You'll create a sysadmin, and that sysadmin account will be available to a group of people who are the sysadmins, but you don't know who's using it when and who's logging in when. If you tie it back to the person and the people responsible, then you've got hopefully a bit more control over those kind of privileged access accounts. And again, we can keep track of who's using our services, and we can do that both for checking to see whether anything bad is going on, but also just to make sure that we've got systems that are working as we expect them. So IAM for projects, and here's Fred Dobbs jealously guarding his project resources. And we know the typical project life cycle is going to be taking what the business needs, running through the project, through a number of gates and checks and processes in order to deliver a solution at the end. And one of the questions really is going to be, where do you start thinking about IAM on that route? Do you think about it once you've got your system in place and then you decide about how you're going to start getting your users in? Or do you think about it right at the beginning when you're getting the requirements and you're making sure that you're not buying a system that you're then going to have trouble integrating and trouble finding how to get people into it? Well, ideally, I think the answer is going to be that you do it as far to the left as possible there. As soon as you start gathering requirements about the system that you need, you're hopefully determining what your IAM needs are as well. Multiple projects are likely to be in play at any one time. So there's also a need from a project point of view to make sure that one project that might be transforming, say, what staff are able to do doesn't necessarily conflict with what another project that's doing what students might need to do that's going on at the same time. So some kind of integration and thought around which projects might be interfering or with each other, or might need to actually coordinate what they're doing from an identity point of view. As well as all the other systems that you've already got in place to make sure that your projects don't come along and make things more difficult to pass that kind of data about people around between organisations, between the different services. Of course, IT is consistently changing. It's always changing, regardless of whether it's a big project going through multiple phases or a program going through multiple projects. And at each stage, really, during a big program, let's get rid of that one, each stage during a big program, you're probably going to need to reassess your IAM requirements on the basis that as you're extending the use of a project, the use of a service that's being delivered through a project, your requirements for IAM may well be changing. Your requirements for the data about people might be changing. Similarly, if you've got a service already in play, already in use, already operational, think about how, as that service it grows and expands and extends, your IAM requirements might extend. You might be going from authenticating hundreds of people a day to thousands of people a day as you extend. So will the IAM services be able to cope with that? Will your service be able to cope with that as well? And similarly, as our services are increasingly moving out to third-party providers or hosted solutions, we need to make sure that we can still get the data about people out consistently to those services. So we might be trying to offer the same service to our users, but as it's coming from a third party, an external provider, we need to make sure that the data about the people within our organisation is available outside our organisation. Whether that's for good or ill, our journey into the cloud. Now, our organisations don't exist in isolation, and we've got new users all the time potentially coming in. We've got new potential applicants applying for our courses, potentially want to become students at our institutions. We want to make things hopefully as easy as possible for them to actually get in. So one of the things we can start thinking about, I don't know whether anyone's already doing this, but allowing them to use their own identities, their own logins that they've got from their own other interactions with other services in order to actually make that initial interaction with the university. And that might be allowing them to log in with their Facebook account or their Google account in order to apply for a course. And then we can decide at some point to provide them with institutional credentials so they can log into our services properly. And the same thing might actually apply for staff. We might want staff to apply, and we can then decide how we're going to interact with staff. But they're managing their own identities, which means we don't need to manage username and passwords for people who might decide not to actually turn up. And similarly, our organisations are increasingly working together, and we increasingly have tools that would allow us to collaborate together. But identity is often a difficult hurdle to overcome. So we might well have services that we want externals to access, or we might want to provide our users with access to external resources at other institutions. But in fact, one of the difficulties can be getting that transfer of information between our institution and other institutions. And again, there are tools and techniques that are available to allow us to do that kind of thing, but it takes a bit of an effort in order to cross some of those hurdles. And similarly for passing things out to those third-party services that might exist out in the cloud. Just a little case of something that is challenging us at the moment at the University of London. Senate House Library is open to students from all the member institutions of the University of London, and we're a big federated university. And Senate House Library welcomes students from across all the member institutions, but when they turn up, they have to re-register to get a card to enter Senate House Library. And wouldn't it be great if they could turn up with their institutional card, and when they tap that on the gate, we can go off to their host institution, their home institution, find out who they are, find out whether they should be coming in, whether their card is valid, and what they're entitled to do. And that's something that we'd greatly like. I know our colleagues in the library would greatly like. But that's just an example of one of the sort of challenges that we have to look forward to. So Twig and Bud. So this is when we're going from maybe a new service or we're something that's relatively new in the IAM space. And I've just thrown some words on the slide here: consolidate, automate, improve, integrate and adopt, which are, I think, the kind of things that we want to be doing anyway with IAM. And these are the benefits that we're hopefully going to be seeing in, if we're doing IAM within our organizations. But we need to be conscious, I think, that if we're going from being a little bud or a little sapling into a fully grown tree in terms of the maturity of our organizations, then we need to be constantly reviewing how we can consolidate and how we can automate and how we can improve, etc. And one of the key things I think is to make sure that IAM doesn't get too far ahead of the other services within the organization, and to make sure that, on the other hand, IAM doesn't get left behind. We don't get left with authentication services that are stuck with old technologies when all the other services that you're implementing through projects or refreshes of your corporate systems are taking us into the future, and the IAM services can't keep up. Or alternatively, we're trying to adopt new IAM technologies and techniques, but we're held back by those legacy systems that can't use and make use of new features. So some conclusions. So here's Rick and Louis walking off into the fog at the end of Casablanca, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. That's my hope, really, for IAM and colleagues within the university and within your universities. So my hope would be that you can see that IAM is actually crucial. It's one of those underpinning kind of areas within IT that all IT systems really either do rely on and don't really appreciate their reliance. It's not. I think one of the key things is that IAM is not just somebody else's problem. It's not another team. There might be an IAM team in your organization, but actually ownership of the data that's feeding into IAM will probably sit with somewhere else in the business, and it might well be sitting in systems that, corporate systems that you are responsible for. And if you're bringing in projects, if you're driving forward projects, you need to make sure that those projects help tie other things together, because that's the only way we're going to be getting the benefits out of doing IAM. So going back to the theme of the conference and foundations and building foundations, obviously I would think IAM is actually one of those foundational elements to building services. And I realise that using the root and branch and the tree metaphor might be a bit dangerous, because you don't really want roots too close to your foundations. But hopefully you get the point, and hopefully the kind of organic nature of my chosen metaphor actually fits in quite well. So thank you for listening. That's my email address if you do want to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a few questions for Tim.
Hi there, it's Phil Common from UWE. Thanks for that, Tim. It was really interesting and actually quite relevant for us as we're going through kind of looking at exploring and adopting an IAM strategy and all the associated branches to it. I'd be interested in your thoughts on taking it back to the beginning of one of your slides about the personas part of it and looking at the student or staff persona but the same person. Whether you've seen the challenge of actually a person having multiple personas within the same system. So an HR system, for example, being an employee but also an HR admin, or the VLE being both a staff admin but also potentially a student, and how you kind of overcame that within the IAM.
One of the things that I try to pull out is this concept of an association. So in that case, it almost doesn't matter which source system you're pulling the data from. You can determine what association somebody has within the organization. You can have multiple associations at the same time. So one person doesn't have to just be staff or student. They can have multiple associations. So you can have one person record, and it's one of the challenges to determine which of those person records that you might have in, say, multiple systems is the master record. But then it doesn't really matter if a person has an association that's coming from multiple systems. If you tie those to the individual person, you can be a student at the same time as you're a member of staff, and you use the association to determine what they can do. So rather than the person determining what they can do, it's the association. So it's a one-to-many relationship you can potentially have with the association, and then from that you can derive the what they can actually do.
Maybe time for one final question?
I'm around for the rest of the day if anyone wants to grab me later on. I'm at the dinner, so please do.
Well, there. Ali?
Sorry, I'll shout. How do you match somebody with two personas? So you've got somebody who's an HR employee and they're also a student. And you've got two separate systems feeding into your identity to get an institutional identity.
Yeah.
How do you match them?
Okay, so I've come across two different ways of doing that. One is to have a kind of matching check after the event. And that might be something that's happening within the identity system. So it's actually saying, oh, are these two people the same? And if they are, do we need to correct these records? A better solution, if you can manage it within your organization, is to push that back to the point where the first record is being created. So when you're creating a member of staff in the HR system, you have an integration that will go and check to see whether people with those similar details already exist, or the same details already exist. And if they do, you can send some information back to the HR system so whoever's entering that data can check and see whether it's the same person. And if it is the same person, give them the same identifier and everything ties together. So one way or the other, you've either got to push it back to the point of initial data entry, or you've got to have a means and facilities in order to be checking that data. And obviously there are various processes that you can use in order to try and do that matching, and maybe do catch-up reports to see whether that's actually happening as you expect it. But there's no simple answer to that. I think everyone will have the same challenge, and you can either put some automation in to try and make things as easy as possible and try and catch the exceptions, or you can struggle on. Does that help?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, like you said, Tim.
Cheers. Thank you.